Brigadier General Guy O. Fort is officially recorded as executed in the southern Philippines during the war. His name is carved into stone on the walls of the missing in Manila, each letter cut clean, final. Yet his body never came home. No coffin, no grave. Only paperwork stamped unrecoverable. For his granddaughter, Barbara Fox, that word became a second loss. "You can't finish mourning," she once said, running her fingers over a photograph that still smells faintly of old paper. Decades later, an elderly former prisoner, Ben Hagens, remembers the sound of boots on dirt, wooden stakes driven into the ground, and a small obelisk nearby, something no one followed. Everyone agrees. Fort was executed. So why is he still missing? The morning Guy O. Fort learned the surrender order had finally reached Mindanao. He shaved the same way he always did. No mirror, no soap. Just cold water scooped from a dented basin and a straight razor he had kept, sharper than regulation required. The steel dragged lightly across his jaw, and he welcomed the sting. "If I can keep that," he used to say, "I can keep order." The camp was already awake around him, boots scraping earth, a pot clanging as someone stirred rice. But Fort held the routine as if it were a line he refused to cross. He folded his razor, wiped it carefully on a scrap of cloth, and tucked it back into his kit beside a small pocket compass, its brass rim dulled from years in Mindanao. The compass had been with him through jungle patrols, negotiations that ended with handshakes instead of gunfire, and nights when the rain fell so hard it erased the sound of voices. It pointed north when he asked it to, even now. He turned it once in his palm and then closed the kit. Outside, Sergeant Ibrahim Ibra Macadado waited with a tin cup of coffee. The coffee was thin and bitter, boiled too long, but Fort took it without comment. Steam rose briefly in the cool morning air before disappearing. Ibra watched him drink, the way men watch someone they are afraid to interrupt. "They say the order is final," Ibra said. He spoke English carefully, the words learned in pieces over years of shared work. "That we lay down arms." Fort adjusted his collar, pinching the fabric until it sat straight. "They say a lot of things," he replied. He did not raise his voice. He never did when it mattered. "Sit." Is a record batter. They sat on an overturned crate, knees nearly touching. Around them, men moved with the restless energy of people pretending not to wait. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else tightened a strap that didn't need tightening. Fort listened to the camp breathe. He thought of his daughter Aurora then, not as she was now grown, married, with a life he only half understood, but as she had been when she asked him for a story, and he'd promised to finish it later. "Soon," he'd said, as if the word could stretch to cover years. He carried her photograph folded inside oilcloth, the edges soft from handling. He hadn't looked at it that morning. He didn't trust himself to. The order itself was simple enough: surrender, report, comply. It came from men who were not standing in the mud of Lanao, not listening to the forest that had already learned to hide fighters. Fort had argued when it arrived, his objections precise, professional. Guerrilla resistance was viable. The terrain favored it. The men were willing. But orders, once given, had weight. He had carried them all his adult life. Colonel Manuel Roxas arrived just after sunrise, his uniform still too clean for the place. Roxas was younger, his face marked by exhaustion that came from thinking 3 steps ahead and seeing too many endings. He greeted Fort with a nod that carried respect and unease. "You don't agree," Roxas said quietly. "No," Fort answered, "but agreement isn't the same as obedience." Roxas hesitated, then leaned closer. "They will treat you differently," he said. "You know that." Fort knew. He also knew why. For decades, he had been the bridge between Americans who didn't bother to learn names and Moro fighters who measured men by whether they kept their word. He had learned the rituals, the customs, the patience required to listen longer than felt comfortable. He had convinced men to lay down arms by promising respect and delivering it. That reputation did not disappear when uniforms changed. Later that morning, Fort called the Moro leaders together, beneath a stand of trees that had survived more storms than any of them. The men arrived with their weapons slung low, bolos catching the light when they moved. Ibra stood at Fort's side, his posture rigid. "We have orders," Fort told them. He did not soften the truth. "I will surrender with my officers." A murmur ran through the group, low and dangerous. One man spat into the dirt. Another shook his head. But you, one of them said, stepping forward. You taught us not to kneel. Fort met his gaze. I taught you to choose your ground, he said. And I am choosing mine. He paused, then made the decision he had been carrying since the order arrived. You will keep your weapons, he continued. All of them. What was issued stays with you. You will fight as you see fit. Ibra inhaled sharply. Sir, it's done, Fort said. He placed his hand briefly on Ibra's shoulder, a touch meant to steady them both. You know the land better than anyone. Use it. The leaders exchanged looks that carried gratitude and grief in equal measure. One of them reached out and pressed his forehead briefly to Fort's knuckles, a gesture of respect that said more than any speech. Fort accepted it without comment. By midday, the camp had the strained calm of a place pretending to be orderly. Fort wrote a short note to his children, the pencil dull against paper that had been folded and unfolded too many times. When this is over, I want one quiet breakfast where nobody salutes. He stopped there. He did not write promises he could not keep. He sealed the note and handed it to Ibra. If anyone asks, Fort said, you tell them I was calm. Ibra swallowed. They will ask why you went. You can do waited. And nined down something. She was a back to very. Fort smiled, a small thing that did not reach his eyes. Tell them someone had to. The transport came in the late afternoon, trucks rattling over ground that remembered every step taken on it. Fort climbed aboard without ceremony. Roxas followed, carrying his own doubts like an extra pack. As the trucks pulled away, Fort corrected his posture, straightened his cap, and looked once more at the line of trees. He did not wave. The journey blurred into heat and motion. Dust settled into seams of clothing, into the corners of eyes. At one stop, a guard offered Fort water. Fort thanked him. The guard looked surprised, then embarrassed, then turned away. On the ship that carried them north, Fort shared space with men who would be remembered, and men who would not. The deck smelled of oil and sweat, the air heavy with the sound of engines. Roxas stood beside him at the rail one evening, watching the water break into patterns that never repeated. You could have vanished, Roxas said. Gone into the hills. Fort shook his head. Then the wrong story survives, he said. And the men who trusted me pay for it. That night, Fort lay on his back and listened to the ship settle. He reached into his kit and felt the familiar edges of the compass without looking. He imagined Aurora older than he had ever seen her, imagined her asking questions he could not answer. He wondered if she would remember his voice or only the shape of his handwriting. When they reached Manila, the city pressed in close noise, movement, the sharp smell of smoke. Fort was separated from some of the others, questioned by men who smiled without warmth. They spoke of cooperation, of influence, of how much blood could be spared if the right words were said to the right people. Fort listened. He answered politely. He refused. I won't ask them to stop, he said. They didn't start this. The transport south came later, smaller, quieter. Fort noticed details the way he always had, the way a guard avoided meeting his eyes, the way another tightened his grip on a rifle when Fort spoke. He felt the weight of the choices he had made settle fully now, not as regret but as clarity. On the last night before they reached Mindanao again, Fort dreamed of breakfast. A table, sunlight, no uniforms. He woke with the taste of coffee in his mouth and the sound of water nearby. When the trucks finally stopped, the ground underfoot was familiar and strange all at once. Trees, he recognized, stood where he remembered them, but the air felt different, charged. Fort stepped down, straightened his jacket, and held his hands loosely at his sides. He thought of Ibra somewhere in the hills, thought of Aurora, waiting for a story that would never be finished. A guard gestured forward. Fort moved without hesitation, carrying with him the quiet certainty that he had chosen his ground and that what came next would echo far beyond the place where he stood. The journey back to Mindanao stripped time of its edges. Fort was moved in stages, train, truck, then the short crossing that smelled of rust and brine, always under guard, always with the sense that the ground itself was being rearranged beneath him. He watched the men around him the way he always had, how they held their rifles, how they avoided or sought eye contact, how a word offered too quickly could mean fear rather than courtesy. He spoke little. When he did, it was measured, as if the words were tools that could still be used carefully. At Manila, the questioning sharpened. Lieutenant Colonel Yoshinari Tanaka arrived with papers folded neatly inside a leather portfolio. Tanaka was not loud. He did not need to be. His authority came from how efficiently he moved a chair closer to the table, how he let pauses stretch until someone felt compelled to fill them. "You have influence," Tanaka said, almost conversational. "Men listen to you." Fort considered the room, the bare bulb, the smell of ink and sweat, the faint echo of traffic beyond the walls. "Men listen when they trust," he replied. "That can't be borrowed." Tanaka smiled thinly. "Trust can be redirected." They spoke for an hour, then another. Tanaka returned to the same point with patient persistence. "Speak to the Moro fighters. Ask them to stop. Prevent more bloodshed. Be reasonable." Fort answered the same way, each time, the repetition deliberate. "I won't ask them to stop," he said. "They didn't choose this." Tanaka closed the portfolio. "Then you understand the consequences." "I do." When Fort was sent south again, the transport was smaller, the guards fewer but closer. The road to Dansalan, cut through country, Fort knew intimately the curve of the river, the slope of hills that held rain longer than expected. He noticed changes: a bridge repaired hastily, a stand of trees thinned. The land remembered conflict the way skin remembers scars. Ben Higgins was already there when Fort arrived, though Fort did not know his name then. Higgins was young, his uniform hanging loose, his hands always searching for something to do. He had learned quickly that attention could be dangerous. He kept his eyes down, his body angled slightly away from authority. He was assigned to a detail near Camp Keithley, moving supplies, cleaning, waiting. On the morning it happened, the air carried the promise of heat early. Higgins remembers the smell first, damp earth mixed with oil, and the sound of hammers striking wood. He did not look up right away. Looking up had consequences. But the rhythm was wrong, too deliberate to ignore. Wooden stakes were being driven into the ground in a clearing not far from the camp. The sound traveled, each strike echoing against the trees. Higgins felt it in his chest. He told himself to keep working. He told himself the day would pass faster if he did. A guard caught his sleeve. "Watch." The man said, not unkindly, "So you understand." They were brought in under guard Fort and 3 other officers: Vesey, Price, Chandler. Their uniforms were worn but intact, buttons dulled, collars straightened by habit rather than expectation. Fort walked without resistance. He looked older than his years, the lines at his eyes deeper, but his posture had not changed. Higgins noticed the small things because the large ones were too much to hold. The way Fort adjusted his footing on uneven ground, the way one of the other officers whispered something that sounded like a joke and earned a brief smile, the way a landmark stood nearby, an obelisk-like marker, pale against the green that seemed out of place, too formal for the clearing. Tanaka stood to one side, hands clasped behind his back. He read from a paper Higgins could not hear. The words mattered less than the order they carried. Guards tied the men to the stakes with rope that scraped audibly against wood. Higgins flinched at the sound. He had learned that sound could lodge in a person and refused to leave. Fort spoke once, not loudly, not for effect. "You can do this," he said, looking toward Tanaka, "but you won't make it right." Tanaka did not respond. He raised his hand. The rifles fired. Higgins felt his knees weaken and locked them. He kept his eyes open because closing them felt like another kind of failure. When it was over, the clearing smelled of cordite and earth, disturbed too quickly. The men were cut down and carried away. Higgins was told to return to his task. He did, hands shaking, breath shallow, mind already building walls around what he had seen. Later that day, Higgins overheard guards talking. Summer, November. The dates shifted in the telling, as if time itself were unreliable under pressure. He learned to keep track of details quietly. The direction of the river nearby, the way the sun cut across the clearing at that hour, the position of the marker. He did not know why he was doing it. He only knew that something in him refused to let it blur completely. Sergeant Iber was not there. He was somewhere in the hills, hearing rumors move faster than facts. Someone had seen smoke. Someone had heard shots. Someone said Fort had been taken north. Someone else said south. Eber blamed himself in the small hours, replaying the moment he accepted the letter, the weight of Fort's hand on his shoulder. He told himself survival was not betrayal. The thought did not settle easily. After the execution, Things moved quickly, and not at all. Camp Keithley returned to its routines, altered only by what was no longer said aloud. The clearing was left alone. The stakes were removed. The ground was smooth in places, left rough in others. Higgins was moved to a different detail. He did not pass the marker again for weeks. Paperwork traveled faster than bodies. Reports were written, filed, summarized. Fort's death was noted. The circumstances were described in language that avoided texture. Executed. Location, approximate. Remains not recovered. The words carried authority. They also carried distance. For the men who had known Fort personally, the news arrived as rumor first. Ibra learned of it from a courier who would not meet his eyes. He sat on a rock and listened, the jungle pressing close. He remembered Fort's voice, correcting his English gently, the way he explained why certain rituals mattered. Ibra pressed his palms together and stayed that way until the sun shifted. Japanese patrols increased. Reprisals followed attacks. Attacks followed reprisals. The Moro fighters fought harder, not because Fort was gone, but because he had not broken. His refusal traveled by word of mouth, carried like a spark. It brought consequences. Villages paid for it. So did patrols. The land took everything. Higgins learned the shape of fear that teaches restraint. He learned when to speak and when to swallow words. He learned how memory can be a burden and a responsibility at the same time. At night, he heard the hammering again. In the mornings, he focused on tasks small enough to complete. Years later, when he tried to explain it, he would struggle to place the timing. Summer blurred into autumn. November arrived quietly. The marker remained in his mind, fixed when other details shifted. He could see it clearly even when faces faded. After the war, teams arrived with maps and shovels. They asked questions that sounded precise. They walked ground that looked right. Higgins was gone by then, moved on, carrying his own life forward because he had to. The clearing near Camp Keithley did not announce itself. The marker did not appear on the maps they carried. The river nearby had changed its banks slightly, enough to confuse a person looking for certainty. For Fort's family, the notice came formal and thin. Executed, date approximate, location Mindanao, remains unrecovered. The phrasing was careful. It offered an end without something to place in the ground. Aurora read it and folded it away. She told herself she would return to it later, when she had more strength. Years passed. Tanaka survived the war. He was questioned. He answered as required. His name appeared in documents that outlived him. The act itself became a line item in history, stripped of heat and sound. The men tied to the stakes became names attached to an event rather than people attached to places. What lingered instead were fragments. Higgins' memory of rope against wood, Ibra's recollection of a promise kept at great cost, Aurora's habit of saving letters even when they arrived too late. None of these were enough on their own. Together, they formed something like a map, but one that had not yet been read correctly. In the years immediately after, the story settled into an official shape. Fort had died. That much was agreed upon. The ground where it happened remained unmarked in any way that mattered. The distance between those two facts widened quietly, carried forward by routines that resumed and lives that adapted. Decades later, Higgins would sit with his hands folded, feeling the weight of what he had seen press closer as his own time shortened. He would think of the marker again, pale and upright, and wonder why it had felt important even then. He did not yet know who would listen. He only knew that the details had stayed with him because they refused to be put down. Ben Higgins had been awake for hours before the phone rang. Sleep came in fragments now, broken by habits formed when listening mattered. He sat at the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold, watching the light change against the wall. At 96, mornings arrived quietly, without urgency, but they carried weight. He counted pills carefully, lined them up the way he once lined up tools order as a way of holding the day steady. When the phone rang, he let it ring once more than necessary. His hand shook as he lifted the receiver. "Yes," he said, before anyone asked who he was. The man on the line introduced himself slowly. John Bear, independent researcher, interested in Mindanao, interested in Camp Keithley. Higgins closed his eyes when he heard the name. It landed with the dull certainty of something long postponed. "I saw it," Hagen said, cutting through the careful introduction. "If that's what you're calling about." There was a pause. Bear did not rush him. That alone felt different. "What did you see?" Bear asked. Hagen's inhaled, the breath shallow at first, then deeper. "4 men," he said, "tied to stakes. One of them was Fort." The words tasted metallic, as if they had been waiting too long. They met a week later, at a table crowded with papers and photographs that Bear had arranged like pieces of a puzzle he refused to let scatter. Bear was younger, restless, his energy contained only by discipline. He listened with his body angled forward, elbows on the table, pen forgotten in his hand. Hagen spoke slowly. He described the clearing near Camp Keithley, the sound of hammers striking wood, the way the ground sloped slightly toward a river he couldn't name then but could see clearly. He described a marker, an obelisk, or something like it standing nearby, pale, unmissable, if you knew to look. "They should have found it," Hagen said, frustration breaking through his careful tone. "It was right there." Bear did not interrupt. When Hagen's finished, Bear slid a black and white aerial photograph across the table. "Is it like this?" he asked. Hagen's leaned closer, squinting. His finger hovered, then settled on a shape near the edge of the frame. "That," he said. "That's it." The room felt smaller then, as if the air itself had drawn closer to listen. For Bear, the memory became a coordinate. He treated it with respect but not reverence. Memories, he believed, were data points shaped by time. They needed context, corroboration, testing. He pulled aerial imagery from 1932, before the war rearranged the land. He traced rivers that had shifted course slightly, overlaid old maps with newer ones, marked places where assumptions might have hardened into errors. Barbara Fox joined them later that afternoon, her presence steady, purposeful. She carried a folder worn at the edges, filled with copies of letters, photographs, official notices that had never quite answered her questions. She listened to Hagen's with a focus that bordered on hunger. "My grandfather," she said when Hagen's finished. "He was always somewhere else in our house, in conversations that stopped too soon." Hagen's nodded. "I didn't do anything," he said suddenly. "I just watched." Barbara shook her head. "You survived," she said. "That's not nothing. Is all this pretty decide I haven't." The three of them fell into a rhythm over the following months. Hagen's recalled details in bursts, often triggered by small things: the angle of sunlight through a window, the smell of damp paper. Bear mapped relentlessly, his walls filling with pinned images and notes. Barbara made calls, sent emails, requested records that arrived, stamped, and incomplete. One afternoon, as rain tapped against the glass, Bear spread out a series of maps. "Look at this," he said, tapping a hand-drawn post-war recovery map. "The axis is off." Barbara leaned in. "Off how?" "North isn't north," Bear said. "Not really. Everything shifts because of it." Hagen's watched them, a quiet intensity settling over him. He felt something he hadn't allowed himself in decades, a cautious relief. "They walked the wrong ground," he said, not as accusation, but as realization. "Yes," Bear replied. "They did. And why?" "If you can do the sen." For Barbara, the discovery landed with a mix of anger and vindication. "So it wasn't that they couldn't find him," she said. "It's that they weren't looking where he was." The implication hung heavy. Years of official certainty suddenly felt thin. Hagen's health began to falter as winter approached. He moved more slowly, tired easily, but his urgency sharpened. "I won't be here forever," he told Bear during one visit, voice steady. "You have to fix it before I go." Bear met his gaze. "We're trying," he said, "but it takes time." "Time is what I don't have," Hagen's replied. Barbara visited Hagen's at his home, bringing copies of aerial photographs enlarged so he could see them clearly. They spread them across the kitchen table, waiting corners with mugs and pill bottles. Hagen's traced lines with his finger, stopping occasionally to close his eyes and recall. "It was near the marker," he said again. "That's what I know." Barbara nodded, committing the words to memory. She thought of her mother, of Aurora, growing older without answers. She thought of the walls of the missing in Manila, of names carved neatly into stone. "I don't want him to stay there," she said softly. Bear began speaking publicly, cautiously, about the possibility of error. He emphasized process, evidence, respect for sovereignty. He also emphasized urgency. Each presentation ended the same way, with an image of the obelisk-like marker, circled in red, hovering between past and present. Skepticism followed. Memories degrade, maps lie, rivers move. Bear acknowledged all of it. That's why we use more than one source, he said. That's why we check. At night, Barbara reread her grandfather's service records, running her fingers over typed lines that listed height, hair color, eye color. She imagined those details as anchors, small but solid. She wondered if Fort had believed anyone would come looking this long after. Hagens dreamed less as his days filled with telling and retelling. The hammering softened in his memory, replaced by the marker's shape, the way it stood as if it expected to be noticed. He began to believe that remembering had been his assignment all along, given without explanation. One evening, as Bear packed up maps after another long session, he paused. "What if the remains aren't there anymore?" he asked quietly. "What if they were moved?" Barbara did not answer right away. She looked at Hagens, at the careful way he folded his hands. "Then we keep looking," she said, "because stopping guarantees we'll never know." The question shifted, subtly but decisively. It was no longer only what happened, but why no one corrected it. Why a witness's memory had waited decades for the right listener. Why a marker had stood unrecorded. Why a family had been handed certainty without substance. As spring approached, Bear submitted formal requests, attaching maps annotated with corrections, references to Hagens's testimony, links to aerial imagery. Responses came back polite, procedural, slow. Barbara learned the language of waiting. Under review, pending, subject to approval. Hagens followed each update with quiet attention. When he grew tired, Barbara read the emails aloud. He nodded, absorbing the cadence of progress measured in months. "Don't let it die with me," he said once, his voice barely above a whisper. Barbara reached across the table and took his hand. "I won't," she said. The modern discovery did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived with alignment, memory, meeting map, witness meeting, patience. It did not answer everything. It did not promise recovery. But it shifted the ground beneath a story long considered settled. For the first time in decades, Fort's disappearance felt less like an ending and more like a question finally being asked in the right place. John Bear had learned to distrust neat conclusions. They tended to arrive too early, carrying the comfort of certainty without earning it. The map that finally changed everything did not look dramatic when he first unfolded it. Thin paper, hand-drawn lines, annotations made by someone who believed they were being precise. It smelled faintly of old ink and dust. Bear laid it flat on the table and weighted the corners with coffee mugs, the way he always did, a habit that kept things from curling back into themselves. "Look at the axis," he said, tapping the page with a pencil. Barbara Fox leaned closer, her shoulder brushing his. "It looks straight. That's the problem," Bear replied. He slid a modern satellite image beneath it, aligning the edges as best he could. "It isn't. Very 17 unrestable inevitable." They sat in silence once, and only once, as the implication took shape. The north-south orientation on the post-war recovery map was off just enough to redirect an entire search. Teams had walked with confidence along the wrong bearing, following rivers that were mislabeled, crossing ground that felt correct because the paperwork said it was. They searched the wrong side of the Aegis, Bear said finally. Barbara exhaled slowly. All those years. Withers space? Withers walks of her God? Withers walks of her God? The discovery reframed everything that came after 1945. It didn't accuse the recovery teams of indifference. It accused the tools they trusted. Men with shovels and clipboards had done what they were told, measuring and digging with care. The failure was quieter than neglect. It was misdirection. Bear sent the corrected overlays to J. Silverstein, a forensic anthropologist known for his restraint. Silverstein studied them carefully, tracing lines with a finger that paused at the river bend Hagens had described. "This narrows it," he said over the phone. "Not to a point, but to a zone." "A zone is enough," Bear replied. "If someone's willing to act." Mike Henshaw joined the conversation later, his voice practical, unadorned. "Soil there is acidic," he said. "Bones don't like that. Time doesn't help either. But if there were bindings, metal, contextual material stakes, hardware that changes things." Barbara listened, absorbing the language of possibility. She wrote notes in the margins of her folder, the pen pressing hard enough to leave indentations on the page beneath. What would it take? She asked. Permission, Henshaw said. Coordination. Patience. The institutional character entered the room without entering at all. DPAA responses arrived in carefully phrased emails, acknowledging receipt, outlining process, emphasizing sovereignty. Each message was correct. Each one took time. Barbara learned to read between lines that were never meant to carry urgency. At home, she spread the materials across her dining table, the surface now permanently marked by highlighters and tape residue. She touched the corner of a photograph of her grandfather in uniform, the paper cool under her fingertips. We're close, she told it, feeling faintly foolish and entirely sincere. Bear traveled to present the findings in person, carrying tubes of maps and a laptop heavy with imagery. In conference rooms that smelled of carpet cleaner and coffee, he spoke calmly, resisting the urge to press too hard. This isn't about reopening old wounds, he said. It's about correcting a direction. A DPAA representative listened with hands folded. We don't act on single-source memories, the representative said, even compelling ones. It isn't single-source, Bear replied. He clicked through overlays, aerial photographs, river courses. It's corroborated by terrain. End quote. 4 minutes broad. It's corroborated by terrain. Silverstein backed him up. The convergence is strong, he said. Stronger than many cases we've pursued. Barbara watched faces carefully. She had learned to read hesitation as a language of its own. Afterward, in the hallway, she caught up to Bear. They're afraid of being wrong, she said. They're afraid of precedent, Bear answered. Admitting a map error opens doors. Back home, Ben Higgins followed the updates with quiet intensity. His hearing had worsened, so Barbara spoke louder when she read the messages aloud. He nodded, his hands folded over a blanket. They walked past it, he said once, not bitterly. I always thought they did. Barbara smiled gently. We're trying to bring them back. Mine Dadens. Of Unride. The reconstruction extended beyond maps. Silverstein requested Fort's enlistment records, the anthropometric details that once felt incidental. Height, build, dental notes sparse but present. Each detail mattered now because it could meet bone with name if the chance arose. At night, Bear dreamed in layers, maps sliding over maps, rivers refusing to stay put. He woke with the sense that being right was not enough. Someone had to agree. The DPAA's caution had its own human rhythm. Staff rotated. Requests moved from desk to desk. A change in administration shifted priorities subtly, like furniture rearranged in a dark room. Barbara learned the names of people who answered phones and those who didn't. She thanked them anyway. One afternoon, she sat across from a DPAA official who spoke kindly. You have to understand, the man said. We can't promise outcomes. I'm not asking for promises, Barbara replied. I'm asking for a chance to correct a mistake. Is Sapper? He looked at her then, really looked, and nodded once. We'll review, he said. Outside, the air felt heavier. Barbara stood on the steps and let the feeling pass through her, rather than around her. She thought of Aurora, of how waiting had shaped her life into compartments of hope deferred. She wondered what waiting would shape in her. Henshaw sent a message a few weeks later. If approval comes through, excavation would be delicate. Stakes leave signatures. So does rope. Barbara read it twice, imagining the ground giving up small truths reluctantly. Bear returned to the maps, refining, checking, doubting himself deliberately. He remembered Higgins' finger hovering over the aerial photo, the certainty that had come with age rather than eroded by it. Memory could be fragile. It could also be stubborn in the right ways. When the DPAA requested additional justification, Bear and Silverstein responded together, their tone respectful, firm. They did not accuse. They demonstrated. The river alignment, the marker location, the corrected bearing. It was, in its way, a reconstruction of trust. Barbara visited Higgins again, bringing the latest printed overlays. He traced the lines slowly. That's it, he said, tapping the page. That's where they stood. She placed her hand over his. "Thank you for keeping it," she said. Higgins shrugged lightly. Someone had to. The waiting stretched. Winter turned to spring. Grass grew tall where no one walked. The zone on the map remained circled in red, patient and unresolved. Barbara checked her phone more often than she admitted. Bear measured progress in emails sent rather than answers received. Then, a response came that shifted the tone, if not the outcome. DPAA acknowledged the map discrepancy explicitly. The word error appeared, cautiously framed. It was not an admission of fault so much as an opening. Barbara read the message twice, then once more aloud to Higgins. He smiled, a small thing that lifted his cheeks. "That's new," he said. "It is," she agreed. Nothing was authorized yet. No shovels moved. No ground was broken. But the reconstruction had done its work. The story of failure had been replaced with a story of correction in progress. The difference mattered to the people who had been carrying it. That evening, Barbara placed the maps back into their folder, smoothing the edges carefully. She stood for a moment at the table, hands resting on the wood, feeling the weight of effort and restraint. Somewhere, across an ocean, the land waited as it always had, indifferent and exacting. The search had not advanced because someone tried harder. It had advanced because someone finally looked in the right direction. The lawsuit did not begin with anger. It began with exhaustion. Barbara Fox sat at her kitchen table, papers spread in uneven stacks, the clock on the wall ticking louder than it used to. She had learned the language of process by then, reviewed, pending, outside current scope phrases that sounded neutral until they accumulated. When she finally agreed to join the other families, it wasn't because she believed the courts could deliver her grandfather. It was because waiting quietly had become another way of losing him. John Patterson understood that feeling, without explanation. His uncle's name was etched into the same stone in Manila, carved with the same promise of remembrance and the same refusal of location. When Patterson spoke, he did not raise his voice. He spoke the way people do when they've said the words many times already. "We're not asking for miracles," he told the attorney during their first call. "We're asking for permission to look." End quote. End quote. The case gathered families the way grief often does, slowly, cautiously, bound by recognition rather than optimism. Different wars, different units, different last letters. The common thread was the word unknown. Men buried with care and honor, but without identity. Men who might not be unknown anymore if someone was allowed to disturb the ground. For Barbara, the idea landed heavily. She had grown up believing her grandfather was lost to jungle and time, his body scattered or claimed by weather and animals. Now she had to consider something colder, that he might be resting beneath a marker that said nothing at all. "I thought lost meant gone," she said once, sitting across from Bear. "This feels worse." Bear nodded. "It's harder to accept when the answer is close enough to touch." And describerful dam. The lawsuit named the defense POW, MIA accounting agency, directly, not as an enemy, but as a gatekeeper. The argument was simple and sharp. Technology had changed. DNA could speak where paperwork had failed. Graves labeled unknown were no longer fixed conclusions. They were hypotheses. DPAA responded the way institutions do, with care, with caution, with language polished by precedent. They emphasized scientific rigor, international agreements, respect for remains. Everything they said was true. None of it addressed the quiet truth the families carried, that unrecoverable had become a habit rather than a conclusion. Ben Higgins followed the news in fragments. His health had declined enough that he no longer read long documents himself. Barbara sat beside him and read aloud, her voice steady even when the words tightened her chest. Higgins listened with his eyes closed, nodding occasionally. "I didn't think it would come to this," he said after one update. "Courtrooms and all." Barbara smiled gently. "Neither did he," she said, meaning Fort. Higgins opened his eyes. "You ever wonder," he asked, "if he thought anyone would come looking?" The question stayed with her longer than the answer would have. As depositions were prepared, Fort's life was reduced to details that could survive scrutiny. Height, approximately 5 feet 7.5 inches. Hair, light. Eyes, blue. Occupation before enlistment, painter. The language was clinical, stripped of warmth, but Barbara recognized its power. These were anchors. These were ways a skeleton could become a person again. She found herself lingering over one line in the old enlistment record, the measurement written by a clerk who could not have known how important it would become. She traced the numbers with her finger, imagining bones laid out on a table decades later, someone checking them against that ink. At night, Barbara dreamed of labels, drawers opening, tags tied to wrists, some blank, some bearing names that didn't belong there. John Patterson called often, his voice steady even when the news wasn't. "They're resisting disinterment," he said one evening. "Not refusing, just delaying. Because once they open one," Barbara said, finishing the thought, "they have to think about opening others." Yes, the lawsuit forced a reckoning that went beyond Fort. It asked what responsibility survived after a war ended, whether honoring the dead meant leaving them undisturbed, or finally letting them speak. DPAA representatives testified carefully, emphasizing that disinterment was irreversible, that mistakes carried consequences. Barbara listened from the gallery, hands folded tightly in her lap. She did not disagree. She only wondered why certainty was granted to old conclusions, but denied to new evidence. During a break, she stepped outside, the air sharp in her lungs. Bear joined her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "They're not wrong to be careful," he said, offering one. "I know," she replied. "I just wish they'd be careful with us too." The human cost surfaced in quieter ways. Barbara's children asked why she traveled so much, why she spent evenings on the phone. She struggled to explain how a man she had never met could shape her days so completely. "He didn't get a grave," she told them finally. "I think that matters. I won, for Higgins." The lawsuit stirred something like guilt. "If I'd spoken sooner," he said once, his voice thin. Barbara shook her head. "You spoke when someone was ready to listen." He looked unconvinced. "I survived," he said. "They didn't." "That doesn't make you responsible," she replied. "But it makes me a witness," he said, "and witnesses have work to do." As filings continued, the idea that Fort might lie beneath a generic marker grew heavier. Barbara imagined visiting Manila someday, standing before a row of identical stones. She imagined kneeling, touching one that might hold him, and not knowing, "Did he die thinking we'd forget him?" she asked Bear one evening, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Bear hesitated, choosing his words. "I think he died believing he did the right thing," he said. Whether anyone remembered was secondary. The answer comforted and unsettled her in equal measure. The government's language unrecoverable returned again and again in filings, a word that sounded final but behaved like a wall. Barbara came to hate it. It suggested effort had been exhausted, when what it really meant was effort had stopped. When the court requested additional briefing, Patterson framed it plainly. "If you don't look," he wrote, "you guarantee failure. If you look, you risk being wrong. Those are not equal outcomes." The lawsuit did not promise victory. It promised friction. It forced the story into public view, where it could no longer be quietly shelved. For Barbara, that alone felt like movement. On a gray afternoon, she visited Higgins again. He was thinner now, the blanket heavier on his knees. She told him about the hearing, about the questions the judge had asked. He listened, then nodded slowly. "Whatever happens," he said, "you didn't let it stay buried." Barbara reached for his hand. "Neither did you." "I do 7. Outside, the season shifted again, unnoticed by court calendars and case numbers. Somewhere, names remained etched in stone. Somewhere else, beneath soil or marble, bones waited without labels that fit. The lawsuit did not answer the question of where Guy Fort lay, but it changed the question itself from "why is he missing?" to "who decides when searching is allowed to end?" By the time spring returned, Barbara Fox had learned to measure progress in gestures rather than decisions. A returned call, a line added to an email, a pause where there used to be a refusal. DPAA had not approved an excavation, but they had not closed the door either. The case lived in that narrow space, neither moving nor still held up by process and time. John Bear continued refining what he could control. He adjusted overlays, recalculated bearings, and printed fresh copies of the corrected map whenever someone new asked to see it. The red circle, marking the proposed zone near Camp Keithley, grew darker with each iteration, ink layered over ink. "If they go in," he said more than once, "this is where they start. The promise said so. And 70 minutes, if you wanted the wrong-sided buying. Barbara kept the map rolled carefully in her bag, a habit she had developed without noticing. It traveled with her to meetings, to courtrooms, to quiet hotel rooms where she rehearsed what she would say if given 5 uninterrupted minutes. She was no longer surprised by how much of her life now revolved around a man who had died before she was born. At DPAA, the conversation shifted subtly. New staff asked old questions again, not out of doubt, but out of obligation. Experts outlined what a recovery would look like, if it were authorized. Controlled excavation, soil screening, documentation down to the centimeter, comparison against family reference samples already on file, mtDNA first, then Y-DNA if material allowed, dental fragments, if any survived. Bone measurements checked against enlistment records written by a clerk in Gloversville decades before the war. Mike Henshaw was blunt when Barbara asked what the ground would give up after so long. Not much, he said, but not nothing. Stakes leave traces. Metal lasts longer than flesh. Context matters. What about identity? She asked. That comes from convergence, he replied. Nothing speaks alone. 9 is happening clogbitions of the Yaum. Ben Higgins listened to these updates from his recliner, the radio muted so he could hear Barbara clearly. His hands rested on a blanket worn thin at the edges, fingers curled slightly, as if still holding on to something invisible. He nodded when she explained the process. The steps that would follow permission. They'll know, he said. If it's him. Barbara hesitated. And if it isn't? Higgins looked at her, eyes clear despite everything. Then at least you won't be wondering, he said. Wondering is heavy. His health declined quickly after that conversation. The days shortened, not by light but by energy. Barbara visited when she could, bringing updates even when there was nothing new to report. One afternoon, as rain streaked the window beside them, Hagen surprised her by asking a question of his own. Did he have a watch? He asked. Barbara frowned. A watch? I remember thinking it was strange, Hagen said slowly. One of them, him, I think had taken it off. Set it on the ground before they tied him. Barbara's breath caught. This was new. You never said that before. Hagen shrugged faintly. Didn't think it mattered. It mattered now. A small object, a habit, a detail that had waited decades to surface. Barbara wrote it down carefully, her hand unsteady. A watch left behind, time deliberately set aside. When Higgins died a few weeks later, the news arrived quietly. Barbara stood in her kitchen holding the phone. The map unrolled on the table in front of her. She did not cry right away. Instead, she sat down and placed her hand over the red circle, as if anchoring it. John Bear attended the small memorial service, standing near the back. He did his part, he said to Barbara afterward. More than most. Barbara nodded. Now we have to do ours. The case did not resolve in the weeks that followed. Approvals still moved slowly. Permissions still required signatures from people far removed from the ground itself. But something had changed. Higgins' testimony was no longer a living clock. It had become a record, fixed and complete. DPAA requested one more review, one more internal assessment of feasibility. The language was careful, but it acknowledged the corrected map, the witness corroboration, the possibility that the burial site or something moved from it still existed. Barbara kept going. She answered emails. She sent documents again when they were misplaced. She reminded people, gently, that Fort was not alone, that Vesey, Price, Chandler were part of the same story, waiting under the same uncertainty. One evening, she took out her grandfather's photograph and placed it beside the map. The image showed him younger than she had ever imagined him. Uniform, crisp, expression steady. She noticed something she hadn't before, the faint outline of a watch chain at his pocket. She imagined the clearing near Camp Keithley, the uneven ground, the marker standing nearby, pale against the green. She imagined a watch placed carefully on the earth, time paused by choice rather than force. Outside, the rain stopped. The window reflected her face overlaid on the map, past and present sharing the same space for a moment. She rolled the paper carefully and returned it to her bag, ready to carry it wherever it needed to go next. Nothing was finished, but nothing was lost to confusion anymore. Somewhere, the ground still held what it held. And now, at least, the search knew where to begin. The wall in Manila does not explain itself. It stands in clean rows of stone, names arranged with discipline, each one equal in size and weight. Brigadier General Guy O. Fort is there, carved with the same care as the others. Visitors trace letters with their fingers, the stone cool even in heat, and move on. The wall tells them who is missing. It does not tell them where to look. Aurora outlived her father by decades. She learned to measure time by ordinary things, birthdays, weddings, mornings that arrived without letters. When she spoke of him late in life, she did not mention rank. She remembered how he corrected his collar, how he promised to finish a story, how the word soon lingered longer than it should have. Barbara Fox carries that inheritance now. Not anger, not vengeance. Just the insistence that a man who raised children and chose loyalty over survival deserves a place in the ground with his name on it. She is still waiting for permission, still folding maps and unfolding them again, still answering questions asked by people who never knew him. Ben Higgins is gone. The last living eyes that saw the stakes driven into the earth have closed. What remains of his witness is fixed now, words on paper. A remembered marker. A watch set down deliberately. Memory has done all it can do. Somewhere in Mindanao, the land has changed and not changed at all. Rivers have shifted slightly. Grass has grown back. Soil has kept what it was given. Whether Fort lies there still, or whether he rests under a marker that says nothing, is not yet resolved. The echo of this story is not the gunfire. It is the misdirection afterward, a wrong line on a map, a search that walked past the truth by degrees, a family taught to accept unrecoverable as an ending. If Fort is found, the wall in Manila will not crumble. His name will be removed quietly, replaced by a grave that can be visited. If he is not, the search will have still exposed something larger. How many others wait under the wrong name, on the wrong map, in the wrong direction? For now, the stone remains. So does the question.